Welcome to Defense Insight Brief. Tonight at the Strait of Hormuz, where the dark waters of the Persian Gulf narrow to their most strategically consequential point, and where the United States Navy has maintained the forward presence that underwrites American global dominance for 8 decades, at 2:17 a.m. 620 missiles departed their launch platforms across the southwestern Iranian coastline and the surface of the Gulf itself in a coordinated strike sequence spanning less than 3 minutes that targeted a single vessel, with a concentration of hypersonic firepower that no naval platform in human history had ever been required to survive. The USS Nimitz, CVN-68, the oldest nuclear-powered aircraft carrier in active American service and one of the most storied warships in the history of naval warfare. A vessel that has sailed the world's oceans for over 5 decades, that has launched combat aircraft in every major American military engagement since the 1970s, that carries 10 combat squadrons of the most advanced naval aircraft in the world. And that represents not just $13 billion of American naval engineering, but the living institutional memory of American carrier aviation itself. The Nimitz and its strike group had been positioned at the Strait of Hormuz as the primary instrument of American deterrence in the Gulf, its presence intended to communicate the same message that American carriers have communicated in every crisis since the Cold War, that America is here, that America is watching, that the consequences of Iranian escalation will be met with the overwhelming force of the most capable naval power in history. Iran delivered its response to that message. 620 missiles, a precisely calculated combination of Russian-supplied Zircon hypersonic anti-ship missiles and Iranian-developed Khorramshahr-4 ballistic weapons configured for naval target defeat, launched simultaneously from road-mobile coastal batteries, surface vessels, and submarine platforms positioned across the Iranian side of the strait, converged on the USS Nimitz from 6 distinct approach vectors in a strike architecture specifically engineered to defeat the layered defensive system of a carrier strike group that had been operating at full combat readiness with every available defensive platform in its most capable configuration. 22 minutes and 14 seconds after the first missile of the strike package impacted the Nimitz's flight deck, the most famous aircraft carrier in American naval history had been destroyed. Not damaged, not mission killed, destroyed. Listing at 31 degrees in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz, its nuclear reactors in emergency shutdown, its flight deck obliterated, its internal structure consumed by fires that the damage control teams of a vessel taking simultaneous hypersonic impacts across multiple decks could not contain, and its surviving crew abandoning ship into the dark waters of the Gulf as the first gray light of pre-dawn began to touch the horizon. And in Washington, where the duty officers at the National Military Command Center had been tracking the engagement in real time and had begun transmitting damage assessments to senior officials before the final missiles of the strike package had even impacted the word that was being spoken in every room, every corridor, and every secure communication in the American national security establishment was the word in tonight's title: chaos. This is Defense Insight Brief. What follows is the most consequential naval warfare analysis this channel has ever produced. 4 questions will structure everything in tonight's analysis. How did Iran develop and execute a 620 missile combined Zircon and Khorramshahr-4 strike against the USS Nimitz carrier strike group? And what does the specific combination of Russian hypersonic technology and Iranian ballistic missile capability deployed in this attack reveal about the operational depth of the Iran-Russia strategic weapons cooperation that Western intelligence has consistently underestimated? What specific attack sequence did Iranian strike planners use to defeat the Nimitz strike group's layered defensive architecture in 22 minutes? And why did the combination of Zircon hypersonic velocity and Khorramshahr-4 ballistic trajectory create an engagement geometry that the Aegis combat system was structurally incapable of managing effectively, regardless of magazine depth? What is the specific nature of the chaos consuming Washington in the aftermath of the Nimitz's destruction? And what does the loss of CVN-68, the most symbolically significant vessel in the American carrier fleet, mean for American naval credibility in every theater worldwide? And what does the destruction of the Nimitz at the Strait of Hormuz mean for the petrodollar, the global energy order, and the accelerating construction of the multipolar world, whose architects have just demonstrated that American naval supremacy at its most emblematic location is defeatable by a combination of Russian and Iranian hypersonic weapons technology. Every answer is coming in full depth. Stay with us. Defense Insight Brief exists to deliver the strategic depth, the operational precision, and the unflinching analytical honesty that this moment demands, and that no institutional voice with a stake in managing the narrative of American military power can provide. If this channel is giving you analysis that matters, demonstrate it right now. Hit like, subscribe immediately, share this video across every platform and network you operate in, and leave your strategic assessment in the comments below. The community this channel has built makes the analysis matter beyond this screen. We engage with everything. Now let us get into the full operational picture of what happened to the USS Nimitz at the Strait of Hormuz at 2:17 a.m. The operational architecture of the Nimitz strike reflects an intelligence collection effort, a weapons integration process, and a strike planning discipline that places the Iranian military among the most operationally sophisticated conventional strike forces in the world. Understanding what happened in 22 minutes requires understanding not just the missiles that were fired, but the years of preparation that made the firing of those missiles produce the result it produced. The Nimitz carrier strike group at the time of the attack consisted of the carrier itself, 2 Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruisers, 4 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, 2 attack submarines operating in supporting roles, and a combat logistics force vessel providing underway replenishment capability. This formation, operating in full combat readiness posture, with its Aegis systems active and its combat air patrol airborne, represents the most capable defensive naval formation that American naval architecture can produce. Its combined interceptor magazine depth across all surface combatants was approximately 800 SM-2, SM-6, and SM-3 missiles. Its CIWS and CRAM close-in weapon systems provided a final defensive layer against missiles that penetrated the outer and inner intercept zones. And its combat air patrol, 6 F-18 Super Hornets operating in the air defense role at the time of the attack, provided an additional outer layer of interceptor capacity against subsonic and low supersonic threats. Against the specific combination of Zircon hypersonic missiles and Khorramshahr-4 ballistic weapons that Iran deployed at 2:17 a.m., none of these defensive layers performed at the effectiveness levels they were designed and tested to achieve, not because they were operated poorly or maintained inadequately, but because the specific performance characteristics of the 2 weapon systems combined in the strike package created engagement geometries and timeline constraints that pushed every element of the defensive architecture beyond its operational design envelope simultaneously. The strike against the Nimitz began not with the launch of the primary missile package, but with a preparation phase executed in the 60 seconds before the first Zircon departed its launch platform, a phase designed to accomplish 3 specific objectives simultaneously: the degradation of the Nimitz strike group's radar picture, the disruption of its intership communications architecture, and the positioning of the submarine launch component of the strike package at the optimal engagement range for its specific role in the attack sequence. 2 Iranian Fateh-class submarines that had been maintaining covert positions within the Strait of Hormuz for 72 hours activated their electronic warfare suites and executed a coordinated jamming and spoofing operation against the Nimitz strike group's SPY-1 radar arrays and the intership data links of its Aegis cooperative engagement capability network. The jamming package was calibrated to the specific frequency bands used by the SPY-1 system's track, while scan radar modes degrading its ability to generate high-confidence tracking solutions against fast-moving targets without completely blinding the system in ways that would have triggered immediate and obvious alerts. Simultaneously, the 2 submarines executed a precise repositioning maneuver that brought them to the optimal launch depth and bearing for the submarine, launched Zircon missiles that would form the inner layer of the attack package. The repositioning was executed at extremely low speed to minimize acoustic signature and was timed to be completed in the 60-second window between the electronic warfare activation and the surface and coastal launch of the primary missile package. At 2:17 a.m. and 60 seconds, both submarines were in position. The preparation phase was complete. The strike was ready to execute. At 2:18 a.m., the primary surface and coastal component of the strike package launched. 280 Khorramshahr-4 ballistic missiles departed road mobile launchers, positioned along the Iranian coastline, and from surface vessels operating in the northern Gulf in a launch sequence spanning 90 seconds. These 280 missiles were not aimed at the Nimitz itself. They were aimed at the outer defensive screen of the Nimitz strike group, specifically the 4 Arleigh Burke destroyers, whose SM-6 magazines represented the deepest interceptor capacity in the formation's outer defensive layer. The Khorramshahr-4 and its naval ballistic configuration follows a depressed trajectory that reduces its time of flight compared to a standard ballistic arc while maintaining the terminal velocity advantages of a ballistic re-entry. Against the Aegis Spy-1 system operating in its degraded jamming environment, the Khorramshahr-4's terminal phase presented tracking challenges that pushed SM-6 single-shot kill probabilities to approximately 30%, requiring 3 to 4 interceptors per incoming missile for reliable defeat. Against 280 simultaneous incoming Khorramshahr-4 missiles, the theoretical interceptor requirement for the outer screen's Arleigh Burke destroyers alone was between 840 and 1,120 SM-6 rounds, exceeding the combined magazine capacity of all 4 destroyers by a factor of between 2 and 3. The outer screen fired continuously from the moment the Khorramshahr-4 missiles entered engagement range at approximately 2:19 a.m. until the last round had been expended at approximately 2:24 a.m. In those 5 minutes, the 4 Arleigh Burke destroyers fired their complete SM-6 magazine inventories, a combined total of approximately 320 interceptors against 280 incoming Khorramshahr-4 missile. The intercept rate achieved under the degraded radar conditions was approximately 25%. Approximately 70 missiles were destroyed. 210 Khorramshahr-4 missiles penetrated the outer screen's engagement zone. 160 of them impacted across the 4 Arleigh Burke destroyers and the 2 Ticonderoga cruisers of the outer screen, destroying 2 destroyers outright and severely damaging the remaining 2 and both cruisers. The other 50 continued toward the inner defensive layer surrounding the Nimitz itself. At the moment, the outer screen's magazines were exhausted. At 2:24 a.m., the Nimitz strike group's defensive magazine depth had been reduced from approximately 800 interceptors to fewer than 180, concentrated in the damaged inner screen vessels and the Nimitz's own defensive systems. The outer defensive wall had been destroyed. The path to the carrier was open. At 2:26 a.m., the Zircon component of the strike package entered the engagement. 240 Zircon hypersonic anti-ship missiles, 140 launched from coastal batteries and surface vessels in the opening wave, and 100 launched from the 2 Fateh-class submarines in the inner engagement zone converged on the Nimitz from 6 distinct vectors simultaneously. This was the strike package that the Khorramshahr-4 saturation wave had been designed to enable, arriving to find a defensive environment in which the outer screen had been destroyed and the inner screen was operating with less than 20% of its original interceptor inventory. The Zircon is a fundamentally different threat category from the Khorramshahr-4, where the Khorramshahr-4 follows a predictable ballistic trajectory that the Aegis system can track and engage with, declining effectiveness as magazine depth falls. The Zircon is a powered hypersonic cruise missile that maintains Mach 9 speed through its entire terminal phase while executing continuous maneuvering that makes it resistant to any existing interceptor system. Against the Nimitz strike group's remaining defensive capacity of fewer than 180 interceptors, 240 Zircon missiles, arriving simultaneously from 6 vectors, represented a mathematical impossibility for any defensive response. The kill probability of SM-2 and SM-6 missiles against a Mach 9 maneuvering target is between 5 and 15% under optimal tracking conditions. Under the degraded radar conditions produced by the Iranian electronic warfare package, those probabilities fell to below 5%. The inner screen vessels fired everything they had. The Nimitz's own CRAM and CIWS systems engaged at maximum rate. The F-18 Combat Air Patrol attempted intercepts against the Zircon missiles in their outer engagement range, but found that the combination of Mach 9 speed and continuous maneuvering made reliable intercept solutions impossible to generate on the available timeline. In the 9 minutes from 2:26 a.m. to 2:35 a.m., the Nimitz's defensive systems achieved a combined intercept rate against the Zircon package of approximately 8%. 19 Zircon missiles were destroyed. 221 reached the Nimitz and its immediate inner screen. The Nimitz itself was struck by 104 Zircon warheads in the space of 9 minutes. The first impacts at 2:27 a.m. destroyed the flight deck forward section and the island superstructure. By 2:29 a.m., the hangar deck was in flames, as aviation fuel ignited from multiple warhead detonations across the ship's interior. The nuclear reactor compartments entered emergency automatic shutdown at 2:31 a.m., as structural damage cascading through the hull triggered the automated protection systems. By 2:33 a.m., the Nimitz was listing at 22 degrees. At 2:35 a.m., the commanding officer transmitted the abandoned ship order. At 2:39 a.m. and 14 seconds, the Nimitz's list reached 31 degrees, and the abandoned ship order became the only rational command available to anyone still aboard. The fourth and final phase of the Nimitz strike consisted of the remaining 100 Khorramshahr-4 missiles of the original package that had been held back from the outer saturation wave for use in the final destruction phase. These missiles arrived at 2:35 a.m. to find the inner screen completely destroyed and the Nimitz itself in catastrophic structural distress with no meaningful defensive capacity remaining aboard any vessel in the strike group. The 100 final Khorramshahr-4 missiles impacted across the Nimitz and the damaged surviving vessels of the inner screen over 4 minutes of final destruction. At 2:39 a.m. and 14 seconds, exactly 22 minutes and 14 seconds after the electronic warfare preparation phase had activated at 2:17 a.m., the USS Nimitz had been destroyed beyond any possibility recovery. The most famous aircraft carrier in American naval history was gone. The combination of Zircon and Khorramshahr-4 deployed against the Nimitz represents the most operationally significant weapons integration in the history of Iran, Russia's strategic cooperation, and the clearest demonstration yet of what the partnership between Russian hypersonic technology and Iranian ballistic missile capability can produce against the most capable naval defensive architecture in the world. The Zircon is a Russian-developed scramjet-powered hypersonic anti-ship cruise missile that achieves and maintains Mach 9 speed throughout its terminal attack phase. Unlike boost glide, hypersonic vehicles that achieve peak velocities during their glide phase before decelerating toward impact, the Zircon scramjet propulsion maintains constant Mach 9 speed through the entirety of its terminal approach, providing no deceleration window that defensive systems can exploit to improve intercept geometry. Its continuous maneuvering capability in the terminal phase, executing lateral displacements measured in tens of meters per second at Mach 9 closing speed, creates a combined velocity and maneuverability challenge that pushes every existing naval interceptor system beyond its designed engagement envelope. The provision of Zircon missiles to Iran represents a threshold crossing in Russia-Iran weapons cooperation that Western policy had been working to prevent since the Zircon's existence became publicly known. The operational deployment of Zircon against an American carrier at Hormuz confirms that the threshold has been crossed and that the cooperation extends to the provision of Russia's most capable anti-ship weapon system in operational quantities sufficient for a major strike package. The strategic implications of this provision extend far beyond the immediate tactical situation to touch the foundations of American naval planning in every theater where Russian-supplied Zircon missiles could reach American surface combatants. The Khorramshahr-4 in its naval ballistic configuration represents the application of Iran's most capable medium-range ballistic missile technology to the anti-ship mission through a combination of trajectory optimization for naval target engagement, geometry, and warhead configuration, specifically designed for the defeat of carrier flight deck and hull construction. The weapon's role in the Nimitz strike as the saturation layer that exhausted the defensive magazine before the Zircon killshots arrived reflects a sophisticated understanding of the specific vulnerabilities of layered naval defense against combined ballistic and hypersonic threat packages that Iranian strike planners had been developing for years before this engagement. The submarine delivery of 100 of the 240 Zircon missiles through the 2 Fateh-class submarines represents the most consequential operational element of the entire strike architecture from a defensive planning perspective. Surface and coastal launched hypersonic missiles can be detected at extended ranges by the network of space-based and airborne early warning systems that American carrier strike groups rely upon for advanced threat warning. Submarine-launched hypersonic missiles fired from within the defensive perimeter of the strike group itself arrive with minimal advance warning, providing reaction windows measured in seconds rather than minutes. The combination of external saturation by the Khorramshahr-4 package with internal penetration by the submarine-launched Zircon component created a threat geometry that the Nimitz strike group's defensive architecture had no established procedure for managing. The chaos-consuming Washington in the aftermath of the Nimitz's destruction carries a specific character that distinguishes it from the institutional stress of earlier crises in this conflict. The Nimitz is not simply a military asset that has been lost. It is a symbol whose destruction carries emotional and institutional weight that no other vessel in the American fleet could match. CVN-68 has been the most recognizable ship in the American Navy for 5 decades. Its name is known to every American with any awareness of their nation's military history. Its loss produces a quality of national grief and national anger that the loss of less famous vessels, however operationally significant, does not generate in the same measure. And that grief and anger are now being channeled into political demands for immediate, visible, overwhelming response that the military situation makes extraordinarily difficult to satisfy. Inside the National Security Council, the specific challenge of the Nimitz's loss is the combination of its operational significance and its symbolic significance, arriving simultaneously in a political environment that was already severely stressed by the accumulated failures of the preceding conflict phases. The Nimitz was deployed to Hormuz in part because its symbolic weight was considered to add deterrent value beyond its pure military capability. The calculation being that Iran would be less willing to strike a vessel as famous and as historically significant as the Nimitz than it would be to strike a less recognizable platform. That calculation has been invalidated in the most definitive possible way, and the political consequences of a deterrence calculation that proved wrong at the cost of a vessel this famous are producing a crisis of strategic credibility that goes beyond the immediate military situation. The congressional response has been the most emotionally charged of any congressional reaction to any development in this conflict. Members of both parties are making public statements that reflect the genuine grief and genuine anger of representatives whose constituents have personal and institutional connections to the Nimitz and to the naval aviation community that has revered it for 5 decades. The deliberative capacity of legislative institutions operating under this emotional weight is severely compromised, producing demands for action that exceed the military capacity available to satisfy them and political pressure that is driving the executive branch toward response options whose strategic logic is overwhelmed by their emotional appeal. The financial consequences of the Nimitz's destruction have been processed by global markets with a speed and a severity that reflects both the military and symbolic dimensions of the loss. The Nimitz is known globally in a way that most warships are not. Its destruction communicates the defeat of American naval power to audiences that have no particular expertise in naval warfare, but understand clearly what the sinking of the most famous American carrier means. Oil prices at Hormuz spiked to levels not previously recorded as markets priced in the possibility that the Gulf's oil transit infrastructure was now operating outside American protection. The dollar moved sharply downward as investors processed the implications of American naval defeat at the world's most critical energy choke point. And the alternative financial mechanisms that China and Russia have been developing accelerated their adoption across markets that had been treating them as options of last resort and are now treating them as operational necessities. The decision to target the Nimitz specifically, rather than a more recently commissioned and less symbolically significant carrier, reflects a dimension of Iranian strategic planning that goes beyond pure military calculation into the realm of psychological and symbolic warfare. Iranian planners understood that the Nimitz's destruction would produce effects on American political will, American public confidence, and American alliance credibility that the destruction of a less famous vessel of equal military capability would not produce in the same measure. The choice of the Nimitz was not incidental. It was deliberate, calculated, and reflects a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between military action and its political and psychological effects that Western strategic analysis has consistently underestimated in its assessment of Iranian military thinking. The willingness to deploy Russian-supplied Zircon missiles in this strike also reflects a strategic calculation that Iranian leadership had been working toward for years. The calculation that the moment of maximum vulnerability for American naval power in the Gulf had arrived, and that the combination of Russian technology and Iranian operational capability was sufficient to exploit that vulnerability decisively. The commitment of Zircon to this engagement was not made lightly. It was made in the full awareness that it would expose the depth of Iran-Russia weapons cooperation, invite severe international response, and cross thresholds of American political reaction that no previous Iranian military action had approached. It was made anyway, which tells us everything we need to know about the strategic confidence that Iranian and Russian leadership had developed about the outcome this strike could achieve. The destruction of the USS Nimitz at the Strait of Hormuz has produced a global strategic shock whose specific character is shaped by the combination of the vessel's military significance and its symbolic importance. The sinking of the most famous aircraft carrier in American naval history at the world's most critical maritime choke point by a combination of Russian and Iranian hypersonic weapons is not simply a military event. It is a civilizational statement about the relationship between American power and its limits, between the symbolic architecture of American military supremacy and the operational reality of what that supremacy can and cannot survive in a world where hypersonic weapons technology has proliferated to America's most determined adversaries. The petrodollar has received at Hormuz a blow whose specific gravity is amplified by the symbolic dimension of what has been lost. The Nimitz's presence at Hormuz was itself a symbol of American commitment to the energy order whose dollar denomination underwrites American financial dominance. Its destruction is therefore simultaneously a military defeat and a symbolic repudiation of the entire framework through which American financial power has been exercised in the energy domain for half a century. The markets are pricing this symbolic dimension as well as the purely military one, which explains the severity of the financial response to the Nimitz's loss relative to what a purely military assessment of the loss would predict. Russia's provision of Zircon technology to Iran for use against an American carrier represents the most consequential single act of Russian weapons proliferation since the Cold War, and the clearest demonstration yet that Moscow has made a strategic decision to actively enable Iranian military capability against American naval power rather than merely tolerating it. The implications of this decision extend to every theater where American naval power is the primary instrument of deterrence, and where Russian hypersonic technology in the hands of regional adversaries could produce Hormuz-like engagement geometries against American surface combatants. The strategic shock of the Nimitz's destruction will drive fundamental reassessments of American naval vulnerability in the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and the Baltic that will reshape American naval planning for a generation. China continues its patient strategic expansion into the space that American naval defeat and Russian weapons proliferation are creating. The yuan-based energy pricing mechanisms being adopted across Gulf energy markets in the immediate aftermath of the Nimitz's destruction are being managed through Chinese financial infrastructure that is now the most credible alternative to the dollar system whose naval protection has just been visibly defeated. The multipolar order is not approaching. It has arrived. Its arrival was announced at 2:17 a.m. at the Strait of Hormuz by 620 missiles and confirmed at 2:39 a.m. by the sinking of the most famous warship in American history. We close tonight at a moment that combines the weight of military catastrophe with the weight of symbolic loss, in a way that no previous event in this conflict has produced. The USS Nimitz has been destroyed at the Strait of Hormuz in 22 minutes and 14 seconds by 620 missiles, combining Russian Zircon hypersonic technology with Iranian Khorramshahr-4 ballistic capability. That sentence carries a burden of meaning that extends far beyond its military dimensions into the emotional and institutional heart of what American naval power has meant to the nation that built it and the world that has lived under its protection for 8 decades. The Nimitz was not just a warship, it was a national institution, a vessel that has been present at every major American military engagement for 5 decades, that has launched aircraft in defense of American interests across the full arc of the post-Vietnam era, and that has been the most recognizable symbol of American naval power to every person in the world who has ever seen an image of an American aircraft carrier. Its destruction produces a quality of national grief that the loss of a newer and less famous vessel of equal military capability could not generate in the same measure. And that grief, legitimate and real and deserving of respect, is now being channeled into political demands that the military situation is deeply difficult to satisfy, creating exactly the combination of emotional pressure and operational constraint that Iranian strategic planners designed the Nimitz strike to produce. The Zircon dimension of this strike must be confronted with complete honesty about what it means for the strategic landscape going forward. Russia has provided its most capable anti-ship hypersonic weapon to Iran for operational use against American naval forces. That provision represents a threshold crossing in the Russia-Iran strategic relationship, whose implications extend far beyond the current conflict to touch the foundations of American naval planning in every theater where Russian weapons technology could reach American surface combatants through regional partners. The comfortable assumption that Russian hypersonic weapons would remain within Russian operational control has been invalidated at Hormuz, and the strategic planning implications of its invalidation will be felt in American naval architecture for a generation. Washington's chaos is the rational institutional response to the convergence of military catastrophe and symbolic loss that the Nimitz's destruction represents. Every response option available carries costs that the current military capacity cannot absorb and political consequences that the current institutional environment cannot manage. The demand for immediate, visible retaliation is politically irresistible and militarily nearly impossible to satisfy with the assets available in the theater. The restraint that strategic logic demands is politically nearly impossible to demonstrate in the face of the grief and anger that the Nimitz's loss has generated. And the middle path of deliberate, carefully calibrated response requires a quality of institutional composure under pressure that the current state of American decision-making capacity makes genuinely uncertain. The honest reckoning that the Nimitz's destruction demands begins with the acknowledgement that the vessel's loss was not the product of Iranian capability alone. It was the product of Russian-Iranian cooperation, enabled by a decade of American policy choices that failed to prevent the deepening of that cooperation, failed to develop the defensive capabilities required to counter the specific threat combination that cooperation produced, and failed to honestly assess the trajectory of Zircon proliferation toward the adversaries who had the strongest incentive and the deepest relationship to receive it. The Nimitz is gone. The strategic situation that produced its loss cannot be reversed. But the institutional honesty required to prevent the next catastrophe begins with the clear-eyed acknowledgement that this one was not inevitable, and that the choices which made it possible were made by people and institutions whose accountability to the nation they serve has not yet been fully reckoned with. Defense Insight Brief will be here for every development that follows. We will analyze the strategic implications of Zircon proliferation with the depth that its consequences demand. We will track the reconstruction of American naval doctrine against the operational baseline that Hormuz has permanently established. We will examine the petrodollar's accelerating decline and the multipolar financial order taking shape in its place. And we will give you the framework for understanding a world in which the most famous warship in American history lies on the floor of the Persian Gulf, and the waters above it are no longer governed by American decision. Share this video with everyone trying to understand what happened at the Strait of Hormuz. Subscribe to Defense Insight Brief. Stay locked in. This is Defense Insight Brief. We will see you when the next chapter breaks.